Long before banners were raised, borders drawn, or a single word of the Constitution imagined, the land that would one day be called America already breathed with life, memory, and meaning. It was not an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, nor a silent continent awaiting discovery. It was a living world, mapped by rivers instead of ink, governed by seasons instead of laws, and remembered through stories rather than written records. The land had names long before it was renamed, and it had guardians long before it had owners. The first people of this land did not arrive with flags or declarations. They arrived with footsteps, with generations of trial and survival etched into their bones. Over thousands of years, they learned the language of the soil and the sky. They understood when the rivers would swell and when the earth would harden. They knew which plants healed, which poisoned, and which fed a village through winter. To them, the land was not property, it was kin. Forests stretched endlessly across the east, dense and breathing, alive with deer, bear, and birds, whose migrations marked time itself. Great plains rolled like oceans of grass in the heart of the continent, shaped by wind and fire. Mountains rose in the west, ancient and watchful, while deserts bloomed with life that thrived against all odds. Every region held communities shaped by the land they inhabited, and in return, they shaped the land gently, deliberately, never forgetting that survival depended on balance. Villages rose not as monuments of dominance, but as extensions of the environment. Homes were built from earth, bark, stone, and bone, materials borrowed, never conquered. Paths followed animal trails. Rivers served as highways, trade routes, and sacred arteries. Life revolved around cycles: planting and harvest, birth and death, peace and war, all understood as parts of a larger rhythm rather than events to be controlled. Governance existed, but it was rooted in responsibility rather than power. Leaders were chosen for wisdom, experience, and the ability to listen. Decisions were debated in councils where voices mattered, not titles. Justice was not about punishment alone, but about restoration, repairing relationships between individuals, communities, and the natural world. Conflict occurred, as it always does among humans, but war was never glorified. It was costly, mourned, and avoided when possible. Spiritual life was inseparable from daily existence. The sacred was not confined to temples or priests. It lived in rivers, stones, animals, and the sky itself. Stories passed from elders to children explained not only how the world came to be, but how one should live within it. These stories were not myths in the dismissive sense. They were libraries of ethics, survival, and identity. Trade networks stretched farther than many would later imagine. Copper, shells, obsidian, food, and ideas moved across vast distances. Languages differed, customs varied, but connection existed. The continent was not isolated tribes scattered in ignorance. It was a complex web of cultures, each adapting to its environment while interacting with others. Children grew up learning not only how to hunt or gather, but how to observe. They learned patience by watching animals, humility by witnessing storms, and gratitude by understanding scarcity. Elders were living archives, respected not for age alone, but for memory. To forget the past was to endanger the future. This world was not perfect. Famine struck when seasons failed. Illness came without warning. Conflicts erupted between nations competing for resources or revenge. Yet even in hardship, the guiding principle remained continuity, how to ensure that those yet unborn would inherit a world capable of sustaining them. Then, slowly at first, the balance shifted. Strange objects began appearing along coastlines: carved wood, unfamiliar metal, cloth dyed in colors unknown to the land. Stories circulated of floating islands on the sea, carrying men who spoke in harsh sounds and wore their beliefs like armor. At first, these visitors were curiosities, sometimes welcomed, sometimes avoided. Trade occurred, misunderstandings followed. The land watched silently as two worlds brushed against each other, neither fully understanding the other. What the newcomers saw was not what existed. They saw forests and assumed emptiness. They saw land without fences and assumed ownership was absent. They measured value by extraction, gold, timber, fur, while the people of the land measured value by sustainability and relationship. Where one side saw opportunity, the other sensed danger. Disease arrived before conquest. Invisible and merciless, it tore through communities that had no defenses against it. Entire villages vanished in a matter of seasons. Elders died, taking languages and histories with them. Children were left without teachers. The land grew quiet in places that had once echoed with ceremony and laughter. The newcomers often did not understand what they had unleashed, but the consequences were irreversible. As populations collapsed, the illusion of emptiness grew stronger.
Settlers claimed lands they'd left abandoned, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that absence was the result of catastrophe, not surrender. Treaties were spoken and broken, promises were translated poorly or not honored at all. The concept of permanent ownership replaced stewardship. The land was no longer a relative, it became a resource. Resistance followed, as it always does when survival is threatened. Some fought openly, others adapted strategically, negotiating, relocating, or blending traditions in hopes of preserving something of their identity. None escaped unchanged. The land itself bore the scars. Forests cleared, animals hunted beyond balance, rivers redirected to serve distant ambitions. Yet, even as flags began to rise and maps were redrawn, the original pulse of the land did not vanish. It remained in place names stripped of their meanings, in trails turned into roads, in agricultural practices adopted without credit. It survived in quiet ceremonies held away from the gaze of authority, in songs sung softly to children, in stories told despite attempts to erase them. The land before the flag was not a prelude meant to be forgotten. It was a foundation, the one deliberately buried beneath narratives of discovery and destiny. To acknowledge it is not to reject the present, but to understand it more honestly. The nation that would emerge did not rise from untouched soil. It rose from land already shaped by human hands, human love, and human sacrifice. Today, highways cross ancient migration paths. Cities rise where councils once gathered. Rivers still flow, though constrained, carrying memories older than any republic. The land remembers even when people choose not to. It remembers the footsteps of those who walked without claiming, who lived without conquering, who understood that belonging was not ownership, their responsibility. Before there was a flag, there was a world, and that world, though wounded, still speaks to those willing to listen.
They came from beyond the edge of the known world, from coastlines where the sea was both a promise and a threat. For generations, the ocean had been a boundary, mysterious, feared, and respected. Yet by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, that boundary began to feel less like an end and more like an invitation. Across villages, ports, and kingdoms, whispers spread of lands unseen, of opportunity unmeasured, of a future that might lie just beyond the horizon. The people who boarded ships bound westward were not a single kind. Some were driven by ambition, others by desperation. Some carried royal commissions, others little more than faith and hunger. There were sailors hardened by storms, farmers fleeing shrinking land, craftsmen seeking markets, and believers escaping persecution. What united them was not certainty, but hope, the fragile belief that the ocean might carry them to something better than what they left behind. The ships themselves were small by modern standards, fragile wooden vessels stitched together with iron, rope, and prayer. They creaked under the weight of cargo and human expectation. Below deck, darkness reigned. The air was thick with salt, sweat, and fear. Food spoiled quickly, water turned foul, rats scurried freely, and illness spread faster than rumor. For weeks or months at a time, the horizon remained unchanged, a flat, merciless line separating sky from sea. Storms arrived without mercy. Waves rose like moving walls, smashing against hulls that were never meant to endure such violence. Men were thrown across decks, masts snapped, and prayers were shouted into the wind. Each storm carried the possibility of erasure, of disappearing into the ocean without record or grave. Many did not survive the crossing, their bodies committed to the sea with brief words and heavy hearts. Yet even in terror, dreams persisted. On calm nights, sailors spoke of land they would claim, homes they would build, fortunes they would make. Some imagined vast fields ripe for cultivation, others cities of gold whispered about in taverns and royal courts. For the deeply religious, the journey was framed as divine purpose, a mission to spread faith to unknown souls. For others, it was escape, from debt, from rigid hierarchies, from lives that offered no upward path. Fear accompanied hope at every turn. What awaited them on the far shore was unknown. Stories circulated of monsters, hostile lands, and savage peoples. Maps were incomplete or wrong, filled with blank spaces and imagined dangers. But fear was often outweighed by the certainty that staying behind meant stagnation or death. The ocean, however deadly, offered movement. When land was finally sighted, it arrived not as triumph, but as disbelief. After endless water, the sight of trees, shorelines, and birds felt unreal. Cheers erupted, tears followed. Some fell to their knees in gratitude, others stared silently, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had crossed. The land seemed impossibly vast, untouched, abundant,
an illusion shaped by exhaustion and expectation. First steps onto shore were cautious. The ground felt unfamiliar beneath their feet, softer or denser than home. The air carried scents unknown, earth richer, forests deeper, silence heavier. These early arrivals did not yet understand that they were stepping into lands already lived in, named and remembered. To them, the new world appeared open, waiting. Encounters with indigenous peoples varied dramatically. In some places, curiosity met curiosity. Gestures replaced language, and exchanges followed. Food for metal, guidance for goods. In others, fear ruled both sides. Weapons were drawn, misunderstandings escalated, and violence erupted quickly. Neither side fully comprehended the other's worldview, and suspicion filled the gaps where understanding failed. The settlers brought more than tools and beliefs. They brought invisible companions, diseases carried unknowingly, against which native populations had no immunity. Illness spread ahead of permanent settlement, devastating communities before they ever met the newcomers. Entire villages weakened or vanished, reinforcing the dangerous myth that the land was empty or abandoned. Survival in the early years was uncertain. Many settlements failed. Crops planted in unfamiliar soil with familiar methods did not thrive. Winters proved harsher than expected, summers more punishing. Hunger stalked camps relentlessly. Letters sent home when they survived the return journey often painted a harsher reality than recruitment pamphlets ever had. Leadership struggled to maintain order. Promises made to recruits clashed with reality. Discipline hardened. Work became relentless. Those who imagined quick prosperity learned instead the slow, grinding nature of frontier life. The new world demanded adaptation, and not all were willing or able to change. Still, persistence reshaped failure into foundation. Settlers learned from the land and, at times, from indigenous knowledge. New crops, new hunting methods, new ways of surviving seasons that refused to mirror Europe. Settlements stabilized, trade routes formed, and the trickle of arrivals became a steady flow. As more ships arrived, motivations evolved. What began as exploration shifted towards colonization. Land was claimed in the name of distant crowns, boundaries drawn without regard for those already living there. Charters granted authority to govern, extract, and expand. The ambitions of individuals merged with the ambitions of empires. The ocean remained central to this transformation. It was the artery connecting old worlds to new ambitions. Ships carried supplies, reinforcements, enslaved people, and ideas. They also carried letters, laws, and expectations imposed from afar. The New World was no longer distant. It was becoming an extension of European power, shaped by policies conceived across the sea. Yet the journey never lost its danger. Shipwrecks continued. Storms claimed lives. Piracy flourished along trade routes. The Atlantic became a contested space, a highway of commerce and conflict. Every crossing tested endurance, and every arrival altered the balance of power on shore. For many, the journey was not voluntary. Enslaved Africans were forced across the ocean in conditions far more brutal than those endured by settlers. Shackled in darkness, stripped of identity, and treated as cargo, they experienced the ocean not as possibility but as terror. Their arrival would shape the New World as profoundly as any explorer's flag or charter. The hopes that carried settlers westward were often fulfilled unevenly. Some found land and stability, others only hardship. Success for one group frequently meant suffering for another. The New World was not a clean slate. It became a contested space where ambition collided with reality, and ideals bent under pressure. Over time, generations born on this side of the ocean began to see themselves differently. The memory of the crossing faded into story, into identity rather than experience. The land became home, not opportunity. Allegiance slowly shifted from distant monarchs to local communities. The seeds of future conflict were planted alongside crops and towns. Looking back, the arrival from across the ocean was not a single moment, but a prolonged transformation. It was shaped by courage and cruelty, faith and greed, resilience and loss. The ocean crossing did not simply transport people. It carried worldviews, hierarchies, and contradictions that would define the emerging society. The New World was not born the moment ships touched shore. It was forged through countless journeys, each marked by fear and hope, each leaving an imprint on the land and its people. The waves that carried those ships have long since erased their paths, but the consequences of those crossings remain, etched into history, identity, and memory. The ocean did not just separate worlds, it bound them together forever.
When the first sustained encounters between indigenous civilizations and European settlers took place, neither side fully understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. These meetings were not isolated moments, but the beginning of a prolonged collision between worlds, shaped by fundamentally different understandings of land, power, faith, and humanity itself. What followed was not a single story of war or peace, but a complex, uneven history of cooperation, conflict, adaptation, and profound misunderstanding. To the indigenous peoples of the continent, the arrival of Europeans was not immediately perceived as conquest. Foreign visitors had appeared before: traders, travelers, distant neighbors from other nations. Initial encounters were often cautious but curious. Gifts were exchanged, food was shared, knowledge was offered, hospitality was extended according to cultural customs that valued relationship building and reciprocity. To many Europeans, however, these first meetings were interpreted through a lens shaped by hierarchy and ambition. They arrived with assumptions formed by centuries of feudalism, religious absolutism, and imperial rivalry. They believed land existed to be claimed, people to be ruled, and belief systems to be replaced. While some settlers genuinely sought coexistence, the larger forces behind colonization, crowns, companies, and churches, rarely shared that goal. Language was the first barrier, and often the most deceptive. Words were translated imperfectly, stripped of cultural meaning. Agreements made through gestures or symbolic rituals were interpreted differently on each side. A promise of shared land became, in European records, a permanent transfer of ownership. A ceremonial welcome was mistaken for submission. Where indigenous leaders spoke of stewardship, settlers heard permission. Despite these misunderstandings, cooperation did occur. Early settlements depended heavily on indigenous knowledge for survival. Crops unfamiliar to Europeans, corn, squash, beans, became lifelines. Hunting techniques, seasonal migration patterns, and methods of navigating rivers and forests were shared openly. Without this assistance, many colonies would have failed entirely. Trade networks developed quickly. Metal tools, textiles, and firearms were exchanged for food, furs, and guidance. These exchanges altered indigenous societies as much as European ones. Access to new technologies shifted power balances between nations. Traditional crafts competed with imported goods. Dependency grew where balance once existed. Yet cooperation existed alongside deepening tension. As European populations expanded, their demands grew. Temporary settlements became permanent towns. Shared spaces became fenced property. Forests were cleared, rivers redirected, animals hunted beyond sustainable limits. To indigenous communities, these actions were not signs of progress, but violations of treaties, of relationships, of the land itself. European legal concepts clashed sharply with indigenous governance systems. Many native societies operated through councils, consensus, and kinship networks rather than centralized authority. Europeans accustomed to kings, governors, and written law struggled or refused to recognize indigenous leadership as legitimate. When agreements failed, settlers often claimed there was no authority to negotiate with, conveniently ignoring systems that did not mirror their own. Religion deepened the divide. Missionaries arrived alongside settlers, convinced they carried spiritual truth to a land they believed was morally empty. Indigenous spiritual systems, deeply integrated with daily life and the natural world, were dismissed as superstition or savagery. Conversion was framed as salvation, resistance as sin. In some communities, elements of Christian belief were incorporated selectively. In others, religion became a battleground. Violence escalated as pressures mounted. Conflicts over land, resources, and sovereignty erupted into skirmishes and wars. These were rarely formal battles between equal forces. Settler militias often targeted villages, crops, and non-combatants. Indigenous resistance, though fierce and strategic, faced overwhelming odds as European populations grew and weaponry advanced. Retaliation bred retaliation, trust eroded, fear replaced curiosity. Stories of betrayal circulated on both sides, hardening attitudes and justified cruelty. What may have begun as misunderstandings evolved into cycles of vows sustained by grief, anger, and loss. Disease continued to devastate indigenous populations, compounding the imbalance. Entire nations were weakened before conflict even began. European observers often interpreted this decline as evidence of divine favor or natural inferiority, reinforcing beliefs that conquest was inevitable or justified. Still, indigenous resistance never disappeared. It adapted. Some nations formed alliances, both among themselves and strategically with rival European powers. Others relocated, regrouped, and preserved cultural practices away from colonial centers. Survival became resistance in a world increasingly hostile to indigenous existence. Children born during this era inherited fractured worlds. Indigenous children grew up navigating cultures under siege, while settler children were raised on narratives of entitlement and destiny. Mixed communities emerged in borderlands, creating new identities shaped by both worlds, and fully accepted by neither. European societies, too, were changed by the clash. Settlers accustomed to rigid social hierarchies encountered environments that demanded flexibility and cooperation. Distance from centralized authority fostered independence and local governance. Exposure to indigenous diplomacy and political systems quietly influenced emerging ideas about representation and freedom, even as those same systems were denied legitimacy. The land itself became a silent witness. Sacred sites were destroyed or repurposed. Hunting grounds vanished. Matted grounds were tied to tanoids and farms. The environment absorbed the consequences of cultural conflict, overuse, imbalance, transformation driven by profit rather than necessity. By the time colonial society stabilized, the original terms of encounter were long forgotten or begotten.
History was recorded primarily by the victors, casting indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress, rather than participants in shaping the continent. Cooperation was minimized, conflict simplified, misunderstanding erased. Yet beneath official narratives, the truth endured. Languages survived to fragments, traditions adapted, stories were passed down, preserving memory against erasure. Indigenous nations did not vanish, they endured, carrying the weight of loss alongside resilience. The Clash of Worlds was not a single moment, but an ongoing process, one that shaped identities, institutions, and values that would later define the emerging nation. It exposed contradictions between ideals of freedom and practices of domination, between faith and violence, between progress and destruction. Understanding this history requires rejecting simplicity. It demands recognition that cooperation and conflict existed simultaneously, often involving the same people in different moments. It requires acknowledging if misunderstanding was not accidental, but often cultivated, useful for those who benefited from imbalance. The meaning of indigenous civilizations and European settlers was not destiny fulfilled, but choices made, choices driven by fear, ambition, and belief. Their consequences remain visible today, not only in land ownership and political boundaries, but in cultural memory and moral responsibility. The clash reshaped the continent, but it did not erase the past. The land remembers, and so it will continue to live with its legacy. To confront this history honestly is not to reopen old wounds, but to understand how deeply they run, and why healing requires truth.
The foundations of early American society were laid with language filled with hope. Words like liberty, opportunity, and freedom echoed across settlements and colonies. Yet beneath these ideals ran a darker current, one that bound human beings in chains while proclaiming the sanctity of human dignity. From its earliest years, the emerging society carried a contradiction so profound that it would shape its moral struggle for centuries. A nation in the making that spoke of freedom while depending on unfreedom for its survival and growth. Forced labor was not new to the world, nor was it unfamiliar to Europe. But in the New World, it took on a scale, permanence, and racial foundation that transformed it into something distinct and devastating. As colonies expanded and the demand for labor grew, the promise of opportunity collided with economic reality. Tobacco, sugar, rice, and later cotton required relentless work under brutal conditions. Voluntary labor was scarce. Indentured servitude filled the gap temporarily, but it was not enough. Across the Atlantic, another journey was unfolding, one marked not by hope, but by terror. Men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported against their will. Torn from their homes, stripped of language and identity, they were forced into ships where suffering was constant and survival uncertain. The ocean crossing became a corridor of death, reshaping lives before they ever reached land. Upon arrival, freedom was not deferred, it was denied outright. People were reduced to property, defined by law as commodities rather than humans. Their labor enriched colonies, while their humanity was systematically erased. Laws were written not merely to control behavior, but to codify inequality. Skin color became destiny. Freedom became conditional. Plantations rose as symbols of prosperity, built on suffering hidden behind wealth and refinement. The system depended on violence, physical punishment, psychological terror, and the constant threat of separation from family. Resistance took many forms: rebellion, escape, sabotage, preservation of culture through song and story. Survival itself became an act of defiance. Meanwhile, colonial leaders spoke eloquently of rights and representation. They protested taxation without consent, condemned tyranny, and demanded autonomy from distant rulers. Yet many of these same voices defended slavery as necessary, justified, or inevitable. The language of liberty stopped short at the boundaries of race and profit. This contradiction was not accidental. It was rationalized through distorted interpretations of religion, pseudoscience, and law. Enslavement was framed as destiny, punishment, or even benevolence. These justifications allowed societies to function without confronting the moral cost of their prosperity. Not all accepted this reality quietly. Abolitionist thought began as a murmur: religious dissenters, enslaved voices, and free individuals who recognized the hypocrisy embedded in the system. Some communities attempted alternatives, others documented cruelty, hoping exposure might lead to change. Yet progress was slow, resisted fiercely by those whose wealth and power depended on bondage. Indigenous peoples, too, were drawn into systems of forced labor. Enslavement, displacement, and coercion followed conquest. Promises of protection and coexistence were broken repeatedly. Treaties were signed and ignored. Freedom offered on paper vanished in practice. The language of civilization masked exploitation. Families suffered in ways rarely recorded. Children were born into captivity.
Parents lived knowing their children could be sold at any moment. Love persisted under constant threat. Culture survived through whispered teachings, adapted rituals, and memory passed like contraband from one generation to the next. At the same time, free black communities emerged in fragile spaces between oppression and autonomy. They built churches, schools, and networks of support, often under threat of violence or legal suppression. Their existence challenged the narrative that freedom and black identity were incompatible. The economy of early America grew inseparable from forced labor. Ports flourished, merchants prospered, and political institutions stabilized on wealth extracted from enslaved bodies. Even those who didn't own slaves benefited indirectly from cheaper goods, expanded markets, and national growth. Responsibility became diffuse, guilt diluted by distance. When revolutionary ideals intensified, the contradiction sharpened. A society declaring all men created equal confronted its own reflection. Some leaders acknowledged the hypocrisy but postponed action. Others denied it outright. Compromise replaced justice. Freedom was declared incomplete, deferred to a future generation. The aftermath left a nation born with unresolved wounds. Slavery did not simply exist alongside freedom, it defined its limits. Broken promises accumulated, shaping mistrust and resistance. The struggle between principle and practice became embedded in law, culture, and identity. Yet even within this darkness, resilience endured. Enslaved people preserved humanity in inhumane conditions. They sang freedom before it arrived, imagined justice before it was written, and asserted dignity where none was granted. Their endurance exposed the moral failure of the system that oppressed them. Chains did not silence the desire for freedom, they amplified it. The early American story cannot be told honestly without confronting these contradictions. Freedom was real but selective. Opportunity existed but unevenly distributed. The promises made at the nation's birth were powerful, but many were broken the moment they were spoken. Understanding this chapter of history is not about assigning simple blame. It is about recognizing that the nation's ideals were forged in tension with its actions. The legacy of that tension did not fade. It evolved, shaping conflicts yet to come. The foundations were laid. The consequences would follow.
Long before open rebellion ignited into war, resistance lived quietly in the shadows. It whispered through taverns and print shops, traveled along dirt roads and river paths, and took shape in conversations never meant for official ears. Beneath the surface of colonial life, where loyalty to distant crowns was still publicly declared, a deeper current was forming. It was a growing unease, a shared sense that the existing order no longer reflected the realities of life in the colonies. Colonial rule was not experienced as a single unified burden. Its weight varied by class, region, and circumstance. For wealthy merchants, restrictions on trade choked opportunity. For farmers, taxes and land policies threatened survival. For artisans, regulations imposed from afar felt arbitrary and insulting. For enslaved people and indigenous nations, colonial power represented yet another layer of domination. These grievances did not always align, but they overlapped enough to create a common tension. At first, resistance was cautious. Colonists were not eager revolutionaries. Many still considered themselves loyal subjects. They petitioned, protested, and negotiated, hoping reform might come without rupture. Assemblies drafted letters, merchants organized boycotts, and pamphlets circulated arguments grounded in tradition and rights rather than rebellion. The language of resistance was careful, measured, designed to avoid accusations of treason. But power rarely loosens its grip voluntarily. As imperial authorities tightened control, enforcement grew harsher. Troops were stationed in cities. Laws were imposed without local consent. Punishments became public displays meant to discourage dissent. Each act of repression pushed resistance further underground, transforming frustration into defiance. Taverns became more than places of drink. They became informal political centers. In the flicker of candlelight, men and women gathered to speak freely, testing ideas they would never voice in daylight. Discussions ranged from practical complaints to radical visions of self-rule. Trust was essential. One careless word could bring ruin. Print culture fueled the quiet rebellion. Pamphlets, essays, and anonymous letters spread ideas faster than authorities could suppress them. Writers challenged the legitimacy of distant rule, arguing that power without representation was tyranny. These texts were passed hand to hand, read aloud to the illiterate, debated fiercely, and hidden quickly when danger approached. Resistance took many forms beyond words. Merchants defied trade restrictions, craftsmen refused to use imported goods, communities organized mutual support to endorse shortages caused by boycotts. These acts of economic defiance were not dramatic, but they were powerful. They required discipline, sacrifice, and collective resolve. Women played a crucial role in this silent resistance. Though excluded from formal politics, they controlled households, consumption, and social networks. By producing goods locally, organizing support, and spreading information, they sustained resistance efforts that might otherwise have collapsed. Their contributions were often unrecorded, but essential. Enslaved people, too, participated in resistance, though their rebellion carried far greater risk.
Escape, sabotage, slowdowns, and the preservation of culture were acts of defiance in a system designed to erase autonomy. Some listened closely to revolutionary rhetoric, recognizing both its promise and its hypocrisy. Freedom was discussed openly, but rarely extended to them. Indigenous resistance followed its own paths. Nations navigated colonial rivalries carefully, forming alliances when necessary and resisting encroachment whenever possible. Their resistance was not new. It was a continuation of centuries of defense against invasion and displacement. Colonial unrest sometimes created opportunities, but it also increased danger as settlers sought land more aggressively. The idea of independence did not emerge fully formed. It evolved through debate and experience. Many feared the consequences of rebellion: economic collapse, military defeat, social chaos. Others feared that independence would simply replace one elite with another. The question was not only whether to break from colonial rule, but what kind of society might follow. Secret organizations began to form, linking resistance across colonies. Information traveled through trusted messengers and coded language. Plans were discussed quietly, contingencies prepared. These networks were fragile, constantly threatened by informants and surveillance. Trust became both currency and risk. Public protests grew bolder, testing the limits of tolerance. Demonstrations turned confrontational. Symbols of authority were mocked, defaced, or destroyed. Each confrontation hardened positions on both sides. Compromise became more difficult. Neutrality became suspect. Violence entered the margins first. Isolated clashes, street fights, intimidation. Authorities responded with force, confirming fears that peaceful resistance would never be enough. Each act of repression created new sympathizers for the cause of independence. Still, the rebellion remained fragmented. Colonies differed in priorities and culture. Economic interests conflicted. Religious divisions persisted. Unity was an aspiration, not a reality. The challenge was not only resisting colonial rule, but imagining cooperation among diverse communities with competing visions. Amid uncertainty, symbols gained power. Flags, slogans, and rituals helped transform scattered resistance into shared identity. These symbols did not erase differences, but they offered a sense of belonging to something larger, a cause worth risking everything for. Fear lingered constantly. Arrest, exile, or execution were real possibilities. Families were divided by loyalty and belief. Friends became strangers. Silence became a survival strategy as much as secrecy. Yet despite the risks, the movement grew. What made rebellion inevitable was not a single law or event, but the accumulation of contradictions. Colonists were asked to obey without voice, to sacrifice without consent, to accept inequality as natural. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened until it could no longer be ignored. By the time rebellion emerged into the open, it had already lived for years in shadows. It had been tested, debated, doubted, and reshaped countless times. The war that followed would appear sudden, but it was the product of long, quiet struggle. Rebellion did not begin with gunfire. It began with listening, with questioning, with refusing to accept that things must remain as they were. The shadows were its cradle. The light would come later.
Revolutions are often remembered through the names of leaders and the dates of battles, but they are born far earlier and far deeper in the quiet transformation of ordinary people. Before banners were raised or declarations written, the revolution began inside kitchens, workshops, fields, and meeting houses. It began when men and women who had never considered themselves political actors started to believe that obedience was no longer a virtue. At first, few imagined themselves as revolutionaries. They were farmers concerned with weather and debt, merchants watching ships idle in harbors, artisans struggling under regulations that favored distant interests. Women managed households stretched thin by shortages and uncertainty. Enslaved people listened carefully to the language of liberty, weighing its promise against lived reality. These individuals did not wake up one morning ready to overturn an empire. They arrived there gradually, through experience, frustration, and choice. The shift was subtle but profound. What had once been endured as inconvenience began to feel like injustice. What had been accepted as authority came to be seen as intrusion. The idea that power should be accountable, that it should arise from the consent of the governed, took root not as an abstract theory, but as a lived necessity. People began to ask not only what laws demanded, but why they should obey them. When confrontation finally came, it did not look like the romanticized images later generations would celebrate. It was chaotic, frightening, and uncertain. The first moments of open resistance were marked by confusion more than confidence. Shots were fired without clear command. Crowds scattered as often as they stood their ground. Fear traveled faster than resolve. Yet something irreversible had begun. Ordinary people crossed lines they could not uncross. A farmer who stood his ground against soldiers could not easily return to quiet submission.
a woman who hid messages or supplies became part of a cause larger than her household. A laborer who joined a local militia accepted risks that would forever alter his sense of self. In choosing resistance, they chose transformation. Revolution demanded sacrifice long before it promised victory. Communities were divided by loyalty and fear. Families fractured. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion. Choosing a side carried consequences, and neutrality became increasingly impossible. Silence itself was interpreted as complicity. The early days of revolution were marked by improvisation. Militias formed from neighbors who had never fought together. Weapons were scarce, training inconsistent. Strategy was shaped by necessity rather than doctrine. What they lacked in experience they compensated for with commitment to home, to community, to the belief that submission was no longer acceptable. Women played a critical role in sustaining the revolution. They managed farms and businesses when men left to fight. They organized aid, produced goods, and maintained communication networks. Some took on roles that defied social norms, acting as messengers, spies, and organizers. Though rarely recognized formally, their labor was essential. Without them, the revolution would have collapsed under its own strain. For enslaved people, the birth of revolution carried both hope and betrayal. The rhetoric of liberty spread quickly, igniting dreams of freedom. Some seized opportunities to escape, others negotiated, resisted, or fought for promises that were often postponed or denied. The revolution challenged the legitimacy of inherited power, but it did not dismantle all hierarchies. The contradiction was stark and deeply felt. Indigenous nations observed the unfolding rebellion with caution. The weakening of imperial authority offered potential openings, but also new dangers. Promises were made, alliances formed, and strategies calculated. Many would later discover that the birth of one revolution meant the continuation of their own dispossession. As the conflict expanded, the revolution reshaped daily life. Markets faltered, shortages deepened, panflation eroded stability. War entered homes through hunger, grief, and fear. Yet endurance became a shared identity. Hardship was reframed as contribution. Survival itself became participation in history. Ideas hardened alongside experience. What began as resistance evolved into ideology. People no longer argued only against specific policies. They questioned the legitimacy of inherited rule itself. Authority based on tradition gave way to authority grounded, at least in theory, in collective will. This shift was radical, unsettling, and incomplete. Leadership emerged not only from elites but from circumstances. Individuals rose because they could organize, persuade, or endure. Others became symbols through action rather than intention. Fame was often accidental, survival uncertain. Many who shaped the revolution would never live to see its outcome. The revolution also demanded imagination. It required people to envision a future they had never known, a society governed not by crown or birthright, but by principles yet untested. This imagining was fragile and contested. Different groups held different visions, and unity was often provisional. Victory, when it came, was not immediately triumphant. It arrived exhausted, uncertain, and burdened with unresolved questions. Independence did not erase inequality. Freedom was unevenly distributed. The revolution succeeded in breaking one form of rule, but it did not complete the transformation it began. Still, the change was real. Ordinary people had altered the course of history by refusing to remain ordinary in the face of injustice. They had challenged the idea that power flowed only from above. They had proven, at great cost, that collective action could reshape the world. The birth of the revolution was not a single moment, nor a singular achievement. It was a process of becoming, painful, uneven, and incomplete. Its legacy would be debated, defended, and contested for generations. But one truth endured. History had shifted not because heroes declared it so, but because countless individuals chose courage over comfort, resistance over silence, and possibility over fear. That choice changed everything.
The Declaration of Independence marked a moment of extraordinary clarity and confusion. With a single act, a people announced themselves to the world as free. Cannons were fired, bells rang, and crowds gathered to hear words that promised a new beginning. Yet beneath the celebration lay an uneasy truth. Independence ended one struggle, but began another. Victory had been declared, but unity remained elusive. The war had forged a shared cause, but not a shared vision. Colonies that had once been linked loosely by resistance now faced the challenge of becoming a nation. The enemy that had unified them was gone, leaving behind differences that had long been overshadowed, differences of economy, culture, geography, and belief. Independence removed the common oppressor. It did not erase internal divisions. For many, the moment of victory was bittersweet. Soldiers returned home to find farms neglected, businesses ruined, and families altered by years of absence. Promises of compensation were slow to materialize. The cost of freedom, once abstract, became painfully tangible. Independence had been won, but peace did not immediately follow. Political uncertainty dominated the early years. The new nation lacked a strong central authority, and many feared replacing one tyranny with another. Power was intentionally decentralized, but the result was confusion rather than harmony.
States guarded their autonomy fiercely, suspicious of any authority beyond their borders. Cooperation was fragile, built more on necessity than trust. Economic instability deepened the strain. War debts loomed large, currencies fluctuated wildly, and trade networks had to be rebuilt from scratch. Regions that had thrived under imperial systems struggled to adapt. Farmers faced foreclosures, veterans protested unpaid wages, and merchants watched markets collapse. Independence had delivered sovereignty, but not prosperity. The ideals proclaimed during the revolution were now tested by reality. The language of equality clashed with entrenched hierarchies. Property ownership determined political participation. Women who had sustained the war effort found themselves excluded from formal power. Enslaved people heard freedom celebrated while remaining bound. Indigenous nations saw independence accelerate rather than halt their displacement. These contradictions sparked debate and disillusionment. What did freedom truly mean, and for whom? Was independence an end or a beginning? The answers varied depending on one's position in society. For some, independence fulfilled long-held aspirations. For others, it exposed the limits of revolutionary change. Political factions emerged quickly, reflecting differing priorities and fears. Some argued for a stronger national government to ensure stability and growth. Others warned that centralized power threatened the very liberty the revolution had secured. These debates were not abstract. They shaped laws, institutions, and the daily lives of citizens. Unity proved difficult because the revolution had never been a single story. Each colony had experienced the war differently. Some had seen constant fighting, others had been relatively untouched. Loyalties had been divided, and not all had supported independence. After victory, former enemies were now expected to live side by side. Reconciliation was uneven. Those labeled disloyal faced suspicion, exile, or violence. Communities struggled to rebuild trust. The war's emotional scars lingered, shaping attitudes and relationships long after the fighting ended. Independence did not wipe the slate clean. It revealed how deeply divided it had been all along. The challenge of governance loomed large. Without a unifying structure, decision-making stalled. Disagreements over taxation, defense, and representation threatened to unravel the fragile union. The fear of chaos competed with the fear of control. The balance between liberty and order became the central dilemma of the new nation. Despite uncertainty, experimentation flourished. New ideas about citizenship, rights, and representation were debated openly. Constitutions were drafted, revised, and contested. The nation was inventing itself in real time, without precedent or guarantee of success. Failure was not only possible, it seemed likely. Ordinary people remained deeply involved. Town meetings, petitions, and local elections reflected an unprecedented level of civic engagement. Yet participation was uneven, and access to power remained limited. The promise of popular sovereignty was inspiring, but its implementation was flawed. The land itself reflected the contradictions of independence. Expansion continued westward, driven by opportunity and entitlement. Indigenous resistance intensified as treaties were broken and borders pushed outward. Independence meant to secure freedom became a justification for conquest. For enslaved people, the post-independence period was marked by both hope and disappointment. Some gained freedom through gradual reforms or personal negotiations. Many more remained enslaved, their status unchanged by revolutionary ideals. The nation's commitment to liberty stopped short of universal application. Still, the idea of independence carried enduring power. It reshaped identity. People began to see themselves not merely as subjects or colonists, but as citizens, even if the definition of citizenship remained contested. The sense of belonging to something new, fragile, and unfinished took hold. The nation existed before it fully understood itself. Its foundations were unstable, its future uncertain. Yet its declaration had altered the course of history. It had proven that authority could be challenged, that governance could be reimagined, and that ordinary people could claim political voice. Independence was not a moment of completion. It was a beginning marked by struggle. The nation declared itself free, but unity would require negotiation, compromise, and conflict. The dreams that fueled the revolution were far from realized, but they endured as benchmarks to which the nation would measure itself. The unfinished work lay ahead.
The story of a nation's founding is often told through declarations, debates, and the names of those who signed their signatures onto parchment. These narratives celebrate vision and courage, yet they leave much unsaid. Beneath the celebrated words and formal ceremonies lived countless individuals whose labor, sacrifice, and resilience shaped the nation just as surely, but whose voices were excluded from its founding promises. Women, Native Americans, and African Americans were present at the birth of the nation, not as spectators, but as participants whose contributions were indispensable and whose exclusion revealed the limits of the ideals proclaimed. The founding era was defined by contradiction. The language of liberty was expansive, yet its application was narrow. Equality was praised in theory, while denied in practice. This gap was not accidental. It was constructed through laws, customs, and assumptions that defined who belonged fully within the political community and who did not. Those left out were not silent, they were silenced. Women were everywhere in the founding era, though rarely acknowledged. They sustained households under the strain of war, managed farms and businesses, and ensured the survival of families while political life unfolded largely without them. They organized boycotts, produced goods to replace imports, and spread political ideas through social networks that extended far beyond formal institutions. Their influence was subtle but powerful, shaping public sentiment and maintaining the economic foundations of resistance. Yet, when independence was declared, women were largely excluded from its political meaning. The same society that praised their sacrifice denied them formal citizenship, voting rights, and legal autonomy. Their labor was essential, but their authority was limited. Women were expected to nurture Republican values in their children while being denied the opportunity to exercise those values themselves. The contradiction was framed as natural order rather than injustice. Some women challenged these limits directly, arguing that a nation founded on liberty could not deny half its population a voice. Others worked within constraints, finding ways to influence outcomes without recognition. Their resistance was often private, expressed through education, writing, and community leadership. Though their names rarely appear in official records, their impact shaped generations. For Native Americans, the founding of the nation marked not inclusion, but escalation of dispossession. Indigenous nations had existed long before colonial boundaries, governed by systems rooted in consensus, responsibility, and deep relationships with the land. These systems were not primitive nor static. They were sophisticated responses to complex environments. Yet the new nation largely refused to recognize indigenous sovereignty as legitimate. During the Revolutionary period, Native nations navigated shifting alliances carefully, seeking survival in a landscape increasingly hostile to their existence. Promises were made and broken repeatedly. Treaties were signed and ignored. Independence did not bring peace. It intensified expansion. Land hunger, framed as opportunity, became policy. The rhetoric of freedom justified conquest. Native voices protested, negotiated, and resisted. They articulated visions of coexistence grounded in mutual respect, only to be dismissed or betrayed. Their exclusion from the founding was not an oversight. It was foundational to the nation's expansion. The denial of indigenous rights allowed the republic to grow while avoiding the moral implications of displacement. African Americans experienced the founding era as both possibility and profound disappointment. The language of freedom resonated deeply with those who had been denied it most completely. Enslaved people listened closely to revolutionary ideals, recognizing their power and hypocrisy. Some seized opportunities to escape or negotiate freedom. Others fought in the war, believing service might earn recognition as citizens. For a small number, these hopes were realized. Gradual emancipation occurred in limited regions. Free black communities emerged, building institutions that fostered education, faith, and mutual aid. These communities challenged prevailing assumptions about race and capability, asserting humanity in the face of systemic denial. For the majority, however, independence changed little. Slavery persisted, protected by law and justified by economic necessity. Enslaved people remained bound even as liberty was celebrated publicly. The contradiction was stark. A nation born of resistance to oppression institutionalized oppression at its core. African American voices spoke nonetheless. They wrote petitions, sermons, and narratives that exposed the moral failure of exclusion. They demanded that the nation live up to its declared principles. These voices were often ignored or suppressed, but they endured, shaping the moral conscience of future generations. The exclusion of these groups was not merely social, it was political. The founding institutions defined citizenship narrowly, embedding inequality into the nation's framework. Power was concentrated among property-owning men, while others were positioned as dependents rather than participants. This structure shaped policy, law, and cultural norms for generations. Yet exclusion did not mean absence. Women's Native Americans and African Americans continued to influence the nation's development in ways both visible and hidden. They preserved knowledge, resisted injustice, and sustained communities. Their labor underwrote economic growth. Their resistance challenged moral complacency. Memory itself became a battleground. Official histories minimized or erased marginalized contributions, presenting the founding as a unified endeavor led by select few. Alternative history survived through oral tradition, letters, and community memory. These narratives preserved truths that official accounts ignored. The nation's ideals were not static, they evolved through struggle. Each generation confronted the gap between promise and reality, often guided by the voices previously excluded. Demands for inclusion drew directly from the founding language, using its ideals as leverage against its limitations. Understanding the founding requires listening to these voices, not as footnotes but as central participants. Their exclusion reveals the unfinished nature of the nation's project. Their impact demonstrates that history is shaped not only by those in power, but by those who challenge it. The founding was not a closed chapter, it was a beginning marked by aspiration and failure. The voices left out did not disappear, they persisted, insisting that freedom be more than a word. Their stories remain essential, not to diminish the founding, but to understand it honestly.
The nation that emerged from revolution was free, but it was not secure. Its independence had been declared, its sovereignty recognized, yet its foundations remained uncertain. What existed was less a unified country than a loose collection of states bound by shared memory of struggle and a fragile agreement to move forward together. The question facing this young nation was not whether it could exist, but whether it could endure. The early years were marked by anxiety. Power had been wrested from empire, but no clear consensus existed on how that power should now be used. Many feared that strong central authority would recreate the tyranny they had just escaped. Others feared that without it, the nation would fracture into rival regions, vulnerable to collapse or foreign influence. Between these fears, governance became an experiment conducted in real time, with consequences felt immediately by ordinary people. Disagreements surfaced everywhere. States argued over borders, debts, and trade. Economic interests clashed. Commercial regions sought stability and credit, while rural communities demanded relief from taxation and debt. The promise of independence did not eliminate hardship. In many ways, it intensified it. Inflation eroded savings, markets fluctuated, and veterans returned to lives no more secure than those they had left behind. Internal conflict soon revealed how thin the line was between order and unrest. When communities protested economic injustice, leaders faced a dilemma: suppress dissent and betray revolutionary ideals, or allow instability to spread and risk collapse. Each decision tested the nation's commitment to the principles it claimed to uphold. At the same time, debates over governance deepened. How much power should reside at the center? How much should remain with the states? Who should be trusted with authority, and how should that authority be restrained? These questions were not abstract. They shaped laws, institutions, and the balance of power that would define national life. Compromise became both necessity and strategy. Agreements were forged not because consensus was reached, but because failure was unacceptable. The resulting systems reflected tension rather than resolution. They balanced ideals with fears, principles with pragmatism. The nation survived its early instability, but at the cost of postponing many moral reckonings. As internal struggles unfolded, the nation's gaze turned outward. Expansion promised opportunity, security, and prosperity. Land beyond existing borders beckoned, framed as destiny rather than decision. For many citizens, expansion represented hope, a chance to own land, build livelihoods, and escape crowded conditions. For policymakers, it offered power and influence. Yet expansion carried consequences that were not accidental nor unforeseen. Indigenous nations stood in the path of growth, their lands redefined as obstacles rather than homelands. Treaties were negotiated, violated, renegotiated, and broken again. Displacement was justified through law and rhetoric that framed conquest as progress. The contradiction was stark. A nation born from resistance to domination became an agent of domination itself. Liberty was evoked to justify exclusion. Freedom for some required dispossession for others. These choices were debated, but often resolved in favor of growth rather than justice. Slavery intensified these moral dilemmas. As the nation expanded, so did the question of whether new territories would permit human bondage. Economic interests, political power, and moral conviction collided repeatedly. Compromises delayed confrontation, but deepened division. Each temporary solution made the eventual reckoning more severe. Regional identities hardened. Differences in economy, culture, and labor systems shaped opposing visions of the nation's future. Unity persisted, but it was strained, maintained through negotiation rather than shared conviction. The nation moved forward, but unevenly, carrying unresolved conflicts beneath its surface. Ordinary people experienced these transformations directly. Expansion uprooted communities, created new ones, and altered relationships to land and labor. Opportunity existed alongside violence and loss. Prosperity for some meant displacement for others. The nation grew stronger, but also more divided. Power expanded not only territorially, but institutionally. The government developed mechanisms to enforce law, regulate commerce, and project authority. These tools brought stability, but also raised concerns about overreach. The balance between liberty and control remained contested. Despite conflict, the nation endured. Its survival was not guaranteed, but it was achieved through constant adjustment. Failure was avoided not through purity of principle, but through persistence and compromise. The result was a nation neither fully just nor fully unified, but resilient. The moral dilemmas of this era were not resolved. They were inherited. Expansion reshaped the continent, embedding inequality and resistance into its fabric. The fragile union became an expanding power, but it did so without fully reconciling its ideals with its actions. The nation moved forward, stronger yet burdened, unified yet divided, its future shaped as much by what it postponed as by what it achieved.
The past does not remain behind. It lingers in language, in law, in landscapes shaped by centuries of decisions. The nation that exists today did not emerge fully formed from a single declaration or victory. It is the accumulation of choices made under pressure, compromises forged in fear, and ideals proclaimed even as they were denied. These choices echo forward, shaping how Americans understand freedom, justice, identity, and belonging. Modern America often speaks of itself as a place of progress, opportunity, and reinvention. Yet every reinvention carries memory. The foundational choices, who was included, who was excluded, what was valued, and what was sacrificed, continue to define the boundaries of national life. The echoes are not abstract, they are present in institutions, inequalities, debates, and aspirations. The idea of freedom remains central to American identity, but its meaning has never been singular. From the beginning, freedom was defined unevenly, expanded for some, restricted for others. This unevenness created a tension that persists. Debates over rights, responsibilities, and equality reflect unresolved questions inherited from the nation's earliest years. Who counts as fully free? Who decides? What obligations accompany liberty? Democracy itself carries the imprint of compromise. The structures of governance were shaped by fear of tyranny as much as faith in the people. This balance produced institutions designed to slow change, protect minority power, and prevent concentration of authority. While these systems provided stability, they also preserved inequality. Modern struggles over representation, voting rights, and political power are not departures from history, they are continuations of it. The legacy of exclusion remains especially visible. Women, indigenous peoples, and African Americans were foundational to the nation's survival and growth, yet denied full participation in its political life. Their exclusion was not temporary oversight, it was embedded into legal and social systems. Efforts to expand rights have often required generations of resistance, activism, and sacrifice. Progress has come, but unevenly and often reluctantly. Racial inequality remains one of the most enduring echoes of the past. Slavery ended, but its consequences did not. Systems of labor exploitation, segregation, and discrimination evolved rather than disappeared. Wealth disparities, access to education, and exposure to injustice reflect historical patterns reinforced over time. The past shapes the present not through inevitability, but through accumulation. Indigenous dispossession also continues to shape the nation's relationship to land and sovereignty. Expansion was framed as destiny, but it required displacement. Treaties were broken, cultures suppressed, and histories erased. Today, debates over land rights, environmental protection, and sovereignty reflect unresolved conflicts between expansionist traditions and the recognition of indigenous presence and authority. The economy bears historical fingerprints as well. Capitalism in America developed alongside forced labor, land seizure, and unequal access to opportunity. The promise of upward mobility has always coexisted with structural barriers. Economic inequality, often framed as individual failure or success, is deeply rooted in historical advantage and exclusion. Cultural identity reflects these echoes too. Stories of self-reliance and independence coexist with histories of collective struggle and mutual aid. National myths celebrate individual achievement while often obscuring the communal labor that made survival possible. These narratives shape values, influencing how Americans interpret success, responsibility, and community. The concept of patriotism is also shaped by the past. Loyalty to the nation has been defined differently across eras, sometimes as unquestioning obedience, other times as principled dissent. The founding itself was an act of rebellion, yet dissent has often been treated with suspicion. This contradiction continues to define debates over protest, criticism, and national belonging. Memory plays a crucial role in how echoes endure. What a nation chooses to remember and forget shapes identity. Monuments, textbooks, and public narratives elevate certain stories while minimizing others. Recent efforts to reassess history reflect a growing recognition that selective memory distorts understanding. A fuller reckoning does not weaken national identity, it deepens it. The tension between idealism and reality remains a defining feature of American life. The nation continues to articulate powerful values, freedom, equality, justice, while struggling to embody them fully. This gap generates both frustration and hope. It invites critique and reform, resistance and renewal. Importantly, the echoes are not only burdens, they are sources of resilience. The same history that produced injustice also produced resistance. Movements for abolition, civil rights, labor protections, and gender equality draw strength from the nation's own ideals. Changes often come not by rejecting the founding principles, but by demanding their fulfillment. Modern Americans inherit both responsibility and possibility. The past does not dictate the future, but it constrains and informs it. Understanding historical echoes allows for conscious choice rather than unconscious repetition. It invites citizens to ask not only where the nation has been, but where it intends to go. The land itself carries memory. Roads follow ancient paths. Cities rise where communities once gathered. Environmental challenges reflect centuries of extraction and neglect. Climate debates echo older questions about stewardship versus exploitation. The future of the land depends on whether lessons long ignored are finally heeded. Identity in America remains dynamic, contested, and unfinished. New voices continue to shape the national story, expanding its meaning. Immigration, cultural exchange, and generational change ensure that America is never static, yet these transformations occur within historical frameworks that influence acceptance, resistance, and belonging. The enduring question is not whether the past still matters, it does, but how it will be engaged. Denial preserves harm, romanticization obscures truth, honest confrontation creates the possibility of growth. The nation's strength has never come from perfection, but from the willingness to struggle toward its ideals. The echoes of the past are neither curses nor guarantees, they are reminders. They call attention to unfinished work and unfulfilled promises. They challenge each generation to decide whether history will be repeated or reinterpreted.
America today is the product of countless choices made long before the present moment. Its identity is layered, its values contested, its future unwritten. The echoes continue, but how they are answered remains a matter of choice. The story is not over.